Sunday, August 24th, 1997, Westmoreland Chapel. We've reached the 38th chapter. We're going to take chapters 38, 39, and 40 today. And remember that so far we have found that Job has been singled out by the Lord as the most righteous man in the world. And Satan challenged that and said, well, you've been so good to him, given him so many things that naturally he's going to serve you because he's getting so much from you. But you take away what he has and see, he'll curse you to your face. And so the Lord allowed Satan to take away his property, to take away his family, and finally to take away his health. And Job, under these terrible experiences, didn't curse God, but blessed God. But then his three friends came to visit him and to comfort him, and their idea was that he must have sinned because God's reward for righteousness is prosperity and good health, and since Job lost it, he must have sinned in order to be condemned by God in this way. And of course there's something to that theology, but it certainly doesn't bear up in every case, and it didn't in Job's case. And Job, of course, he had subscribed to that theology too, but now his conscience bore witness to him that he hadn't sinned, and therefore there was a terrible struggle going on with him. And this goes on for chapter after chapter. And the friends condemn him. Job brings out the fact that providential circumstances don't stand up to their theology, because a lot of times there's good men who suffer and bad men who don't. And when he brought this out, why the three friends thought he was a heretic, and they condemned him in no uncertain terms. Then a fourth man, Elihu, enters the contest, and he brings in perhaps one element that's helpful. He said, Job, you're being chastised to make you more pure in God's sight. If you'll just humble yourself, why, he will restore you. And there was an element of truth in that, but Job didn't respond to it. And so finally, the Lord appears to Job. And in fact, we might say that in the course of the debate, Job says a lot of very bad things about God. He says God isn't just, that he blesses the wicked and curses the righteous, and he's become my enemy and he's treating me very cruelly. And he really said a lot of bad things about the Lord. And his three friends, and Elihu too, were just horrified at that. But now the Lord comes into this situation, chapter 38. And I've summarized chapter 38 this way. God teaches Job of his own matchless greatness and Job's comparative deficiency. Now we're going to do is we had 3 chapters to cover, so we're going to have to go hurriedly. And I'm going to read just parts of the text. Now I hope you can stay up with me. In verse 1 he says, Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. God appeared to him in a kind of a tempest. And in verse 2 he says, Who is this who darkens counsel with words without knowledge? I will question you, and you shall answer me. verse 3. Verse 4. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? And then verse 5. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Verse 6. To what were its foundations fashioned? Now, and then verse 7. When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. In other words, God's saying, He's bringing out to Job how completely inadequate he is to judge God. Because Job was completely out of the picture when the earth was made. He had nothing whatever to do with it. He couldn't have had any hand in it if he had been there, because he's utterly incapable of doing such great and majestic and infinitely marvelous work as God had done in creation. And then he goes on in verse 10 and says, who shut in the sea with doors? Verse 8, rather, and then verse 10, when I fixed my limit for it. Verse 11, when I said, here your proud waves must stop. I think I've mentioned to you before, but it's worth repeating, that I got a new appreciation of the fact that God keeps the oceans in their beds. When I was a kid, my cousin and I were responsible for taking water from a well and watering the horses. We had a great big tub, kind of like a big wash tub, to pump the water, and then we had to carry it over to where the horses were. And if you weren't careful, if you got it jiggling, well, the water would keep jiggling and start going back and forth, and the waves would go up over the sides, and about halfway there you had no water left. I don't know if you've ever tried that, but it's an amazing phenomenon. You just can't believe it. Is that water all going to bounce out of there? But if you have a large container, the larger the container, the harder it is to control that. And the ocean is a very large container. And just a little bouncing, a little bumping of the earth, and you'd have waves going over the seashores a mile high. Just think of that. What terrible. Just one wave like that could destroy a whole state, and maybe even more. But God has said, you proud waves, you stay there and don't get out of your bounds. Isn't that a marvelous thing? I know when I was a kid, back in Kansas, we had a little river called the Wakarusa River. And it was, you could jump across it in the summertime, but in the flood times it was a mile wide. And that Wakarusa River didn't stay within its bounds at all. But the ocean does better than that. It doesn't ever get a mile going to the inland, a mile. And just think of what a marvelous thing it is that God has told that ocean to stay there, and it does. What a terrible, frightful thing it would be to live around an ocean if it was always getting out of its banks and doing like the rivers do. And so God points out that to Job. Job, how about you trying to keep the oceans in their bounds? See, that's what he's doing over and over again. This is really a refreshing thing, too. It's very helpful in your thinking. Because God is, we don't often think of this, that God's faced with problems that we never even dream of. And that's what he's telling Job about here. Job, I've got problems that you have no conception of. And I have to do things that you can't even begin to do. And yet you're judging me. You're saying God's not unjust, or God's not just, and He's cruel, and so forth. Well, let's move on here. Verse 12. Have you commanded the morning since your days began? In other words, Job, does the sun come up at your command? Verse 15. From the wicked their light is withheld. Verse 16. Have you entered the springs of the sea? By the way, in Job's day, they didn't even know that the sea had springs. It's only been recently they found that out. There's tremendous springs in the oceans in certain parts, just gushing out of the ocean bottom. Tremendous quantities of water. And it's fresh water too, it's not salt water. It becomes salty, of course, as the waters evaporate and as the rivers bring salt down into the ocean. And then it has no way to get out of the ocean, so it makes the ocean salty. Verse 17, have the gates of death been revealed to you? There's another whole realm that Job knows and nobody knows anything about. What happens to you after you die? Nobody knows that. God knows all about it. He's provided. Just think, He's got to provide for all those people that die. Just think of that. I mean, He has problems that you can't eat. I remember watching the sea lions on the coast of Oregon and how there's a whole bunch of them down there, and how every once in a while one of them would plunge off into the water and go down and come up with a fish, and gobble it down and then go back and waddle back up on the seashore and just lay down in the sun. All he had to do was just go down out into the ocean and find his meal and come back. Didn't take him long either. Now, and I was just thinking, what a tremendous expense that would be for anybody if they had to supply all those fish for those sea lions. And that was just one bunch. But God has to supply food for everything. Every living thing, God supplies food for. And not only does He supply food, but He gives them the wisdom to know how to get it. I mean, each one of them have a different source of food, and each one of them have to have a different way of getting it. God has to put all of that into His creatures' minds. Then, verse 18, have you comprehended the breadth of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. Where is the way of the dwelling of light and darkness? By the way, notice he uses the word way of the dwelling of light. And a way is a place where people travel. It's the same word as path or road. And the suggestion here is that light travels. And of course we know that's true. Light is never still. If light quits traveling, it becomes darkness. And so there's another notice down here, verse 21. Do you know it? Because the number of your days is great. Have you entered the treasury of the snow and the hail? Verse 22, verse 24. By what way, here's a way again used with light, is light diffused or divided? And of course they didn't know it back then, but you can diffuse light and single out all the different colors of the rainbow. That's what the rainbow does. That's what the mist in the air does, that for the light, giving us a rainbow. In verse 26 and 27, who causes it to rain and causes to spring forth the tender grass? Verse 28, 29, and 30, from whose womb comes the ice? The water hardens like stone. In verse 31 and 33, can you bind the cluster of Pleiades? Do you know the ordinance of the heavens? Just think of it. God causes all those vast number of stars out there. They all have their paths to take. They all obey certain laws of God. And they all, just like marvelous clockwork, circle around one another. And God has to direct all of that. Verse 36 and 39. Who has put wisdom in the mind? Just think of the whole subject of the human mind is tremendous, tremendous subject. Because the mind is capable of such stupendous things. And God is the one that made the mind with all of its vast powers. And then verse 39. Can you hunt the prey for the lion? Just think, if God hadn't put the wisdom in the lion and the ability in the lions, not only the wisdom but the power to hunt prey, lions wouldn't last long. Verse 41. Who provides food for the raven when its young ones cry to God? Isn't that something? God says they're crying to me and I supply them food. And they have a different way of getting it. That's another thing. If you look at the birds, just look at a bird sometime and watch it flying around. What tremendous skill that bird had. It just goes going around all and then comes up and lights on a branch and puts on the brakes. Honestly, you can just worship the Lord watching a bird fly around. And what marvelous. Try watching a hummingbird sometime. And God has to put all that into him. He's telling Job now, Job, can you do all this? And then in chapter 39 is summarized a glance at God's greatness and Job's lack as seen in animal and bird life further stresses Job's presumption in criticizing God. Verse 1. Do you know the time when the wild mountain goats bear young? Verse 4. Their young ones grow strong, depart and do not return from them. Just think of all the animals that they are born, and some of them are forsaken by their parents right away. They have to learn how to operate right from the very beginning. And God puts all that wisdom in, knowing just what to do. All the skills they need to survive are put right in their brains right in the beginning. What a marvelous God. What a tremendous power and wisdom He has. And then verses 5 and 6. Who set the wild donkey free, whose home I have made the wilderness? He scorns the tumult of the city, verses 7 and 8. The range of the mountains is his pasture. Verse 9 and 10. Will the wild ox be willing to serve you? Will he plow the valleys behind you? And then verses 13 to 17 is rather strange. The ostrich leaves her eggs on the ground. She forgets that a foot may crush them. She treats her young harshly, as though they were not hers. Because, now look at this, God deprived her of wisdom. Isn't that something? God gives wisdom along certain lines, and along other lines He deprives His creatures of it. Verses 19, 21, 22, and 25 are about the horse. Have you given the horse strength? He rejoices in his strength. He gallops into the clash of arms. He mocks at fear. At the blast of the trumpet he says, aha. Just imagine what a thrilling thing it would be to see some of those horses during times of battle. Of course, this is no longer done. But back in the days when the horses were used for battle, what an amazing thing it would be to see them. because evidently they just gloried in the battle and just plunged into it with all their might and main. Boy, that would be warfare back in those days was something fierce. We have a lot more destructive weapons, but I don't know what we have a easier life as fighting people. Our armies aren't. Of course, sometimes they're subject to hand-to-hand combat, but not very often anymore. Verse 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30. Does the hawk fly by your wisdom, the eagle, its eyes observe from afar, and where the slain are, there it is. Again, God equipping His creatures with amazing powers. Chapter 40. When faced with the fact that Job tried to condemn God in order to justify himself, Job repents and humbles himself before God. Verses 1 and 2. Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, Shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer it. Verse 3 to 5. Then Job answered, Behold, I am vile. Or this couple of other versions translate that of small account. I think is a better translation, really, because that's what God is trying to get across to Job, his smallness in view of God's greatness. And Job is totally incapable of judging God like he's trying to do. Then Job answered, Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. I will not answer. Verse 6 and 7. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Now you prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Verse 8. Would you indeed annul my judgment? Would you condemn me that you may be justified? Have you an arm like God, a voice like His? Then adorn yourself with majesty and splendor. Verse 10. Verse 11. Look on everyone who is proud and humble him. Verse 12. Tread down the wicked in their place. Verse 14. Then I will also confess to you that your own right hand can save you. Now, you can see from this that God is seeking to bring Job to the place where he truly repents of his judging of God. Because even though God says some very good things about Job later, nevertheless, he had to correct this in him. There was something bad in Job, in that even under tremendous pressure, this terrible criticism of God came out. And now God is seeking to correct that in him. And He's doing it by saying, Job, you're just incapable of judging my providential movings. And then the last thing he brings up is verses 15 to 18. Look now at Behemoth, which I made along with you. Now this is a big, strong animal of some kind. A lot of people think it's the hippopotamus. But notice what he says about it. He eats grass. His strength is in his hips and in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. Well, if you've ever seen a hippopotamus, he doesn't have any tail like a cedar. It's just a little bitty thing like a pig. And so I don't think it could be a hippopotamus. Actually, I think it really was a dinosaur. Because I think back in Job's day, which was about 4,000 years ago, there were still some remnants of the dinosaurs in there. In fact, in Texas, they found some footprints of men right in the same area as the footprints of dinosaurs. The only reason they haven't accepted it is because it doesn't fit in with the evolutionary theory And so they throw it out. They won't even consider it. But that's an actual, they've got that on record and in museums. Then in verse 18, the sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze. And verse 19 to 21 and then 23. He is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. The mountains yield food for him. He lies under the lotus trees. The river may rage, yet he is not disturbed. He is confident, though the Jordan gushes into his mouth. And so this is a tremendously strong animal, so much so that the men of that day were no match for it at all. Now, in closing, let's just think of some things here that we might learn from this passage today. This is a quotation, I think a very apt quotation from the Wycliffe Bible Commentary. It says, again in this section, that we just read, the purpose is to convince Job of his incompetence for the role of world governor. And you see, that's what Job was really, he was setting himself up to judge God and to say, so to speak, Lord, you're the governor of this world, but I think I can do a better job because you're not doing it justly. And God's saying, look, Job, you don't know what you're talking about. The purpose is to convince Job of his incompetence for the role of world governor, while magnifying the wisdom of him who actually is creation's ruler. Job's criticism of God's government was, in principle, now listen to this, Job's criticism of God's government was, in principle, a usurpation of the divine prerogative of world government, a self-deification. In other words, Job was saying, I can do a better job of governing the world than God can, because he's not doing it right. And so that's what now, actually the questions that Job and his 4 friends tried to answer, God doesn't even take up. He doesn't answer why it is that righteous people suffer. He simply points out that the business of ruling the world is such a tremendously, infinitely complicated. It takes a person with infinite wisdom and power to do it. And therefore, if you think that God's providential dealings are wrong or unjust, and a lot of times we have questions, along that line. A little kid dies of cancer or something like that. You say, how can that be just? Lord, why did you allow that? That's happening all the time. People are questioning God's providential dealings in their lives or the lives of other people. And God is saying here through Job and to Job that look, the job of governing the world is just too great for you poor little human beings. You just don't understand what's all involved. And what you have to do is just accept what I'm doing and trust me that it's right and it's best. Now, several other things I have to bring out here. To become offended with God and to become critical of what He does, although we may not say it, is a very common error we fall into, and one Satan is ever seeking to push us into. Now, this is a tremendous statement. Just listen to this again. To become offended with God and to become critical of what He does, although we may not say it, is a very common error we fall into, and one which Satan is ever seeking to push us into. It talks about the fiery darts of the devil. And the devil is firing these fiery darts at people every day. Something happens to them. And the devil put a fiery dart and saying, look at that, God's not right in doing that. He doesn't love you. Look at what he allowed to happen to you. And that's a fiery dart that we have to deal with. And that's the same thing that Job had to deal with, you see. Things were happening to him that just didn't seem reasonable. They seemed cruel. And notice, too, that God never explained to Job what was behind the temptation the trial that he came into. He never explained to him about that. And God will do that with us. He will never explain the real reasons behind it, because He's testing us. He's bringing out something that's very important to Him. Now, this is why the ministry of reconciliation is such an important ministry to Christians. For many are, to one degree or another, not reconciled to God. Turn for a minute to 2 Corinthians 5. This is a tremendous thing. Ordinarily, we don't remind ourselves that 2 Corinthians was written to Christians. 2 Corinthians 5:18. Now all things are of God, who has reconciled us to Himself through Jesus Christ, and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, that God was in Christ, reconciling the world to Himself, not imputing their trespasses to them, and has committed to us the word of reconciliation. Therefore we are ambassadors for Christ, as though God were pleading through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. Now, isn't that something? Now just think of what it's saying here. It's saying that God, because of the death of Christ, has no quarrel with you anymore. He's perfectly reconciled to you because Christ has paid the penalty for all of your sin. Now, the problem is you're not reconciled to God. You're holding things against God. You're not completely satisfied with the way God has run your life. And consequently, you're holding out on God. Last night I was singing the Psalm 103, and it comes to the place where it says, bless the Lord, O my soul, bless Him. All that is within me, bless His holy name. And I was asking myself, can I say that? All that's in me, bless His holy name? Or is there certain reservations I'm making, so that I don't with my whole heart and soul, with everything within me, bless the holy name of God? And I found I have some things against God, and I've got to get through them so that I can really give myself wholly to Him without reservation. And I'm sure that this is true of many, many Christians, that they're not wholly reconciled to God. And that's why the apostle here, he's talking to Christians. This is not talking to non-Christians. It was written to the Corinthian church. And God is, look at that verse 20, as though God were pleading. God's begging. We implore you, on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. In other words, get through the things that you have against God. You see, that was Job's trouble. Job was a righteous man, the most righteous man in the world. But he had some things against God. And he felt very bitter about God. And he said some very bitter things about Him. See, he wasn't wholly, completely reconciled to Him. And one thing is that he tried to take too much upon himself. Look at Psalm 131. Psalm 131. Lord, my heart is not haughty, nor my eyes lofty. Neither do I concern myself with great matters, nor with things too profound for me. Surely I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with his mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. And you see, that's what Job was doing. He was trying to concern himself with things that were too high for him. And he had to come down off of that and admit that that was too much for him. And that's a lesson I think that we can take from this portion of Scripture, is that God's providential dealings are just too complicated for us. We just have to accept, we have to go by faith, because we can't go by sight here. There's too many things behind, too many things that God has to deal with. And God works in everything. And I remember a good example. I preached once here on all things work together for good to them that love God and them that are called according to His purpose. And David Blomberg was here and he got mad because, of course, he's got a handicap and he's holding it against God. I don't know whether he is still or not. I think probably he is though. And he got mad and went out and back, and I went out and back after the sermon to talk to him about it. And he got mad at me and hauled off and swung at me. But it shows how bitter he was, you see, against God because of something that happened to him in his life. And you have to put yourself in his place. If you'd been born with this handicap, perhaps you would have been in the same boat that he was in. And I think it's important for us to pray for David, that he might get through that. And because, see, he's in the same problem that Job had. Something happening to him, and he was bitter about it. He blames God. And this happens all the time. It should help us when we become disgruntled with God to remember how utterly unfit we are to judge one so infinitely great. It would be to our advantage to make better use of the study of nature as a means of viewing God's greatness. The advances in science give us an advantage here too. Well, just in closing, I was going to take up talking about the cross and how much it puts us in a much better position than Job was in. But I think I'll save that for next time. But just in closing, we ought to take much more advantage, and these chapters prove it, that we should take much more advantage in studying nature and worshiping God as we do. You see, God in all these chapters is just pointing out His greatness in nature and His amazing greatness. And we're much better equipped to do that because science has gone a lot further into discovering the greatness of God in nature than Job had access to. And so we have a much better opportunity to see God's greatness as displayed in nature than he did. Shall we pray? Father, we thank you that you have shown us a way out of our bitterness against you because of things that have happened to us or happened to other people that we know. Lord, expose it, we pray thee, and help us to see that we're just too little to judge you in these matters. We have to walk by faith and not by sight in this matter of providential happenings. And we have to see that God has a job that's just too big for us to try to judge. In Jesus' name, amen.